Greetings, little adventurer. Do you know what I am? Because I know what I am. I may not be the smartest creature in the world, but there's a lot of me.
Hi, I'm Javen Baker, and you just witnessed Goblins. So, what's a goblin? Well, let's talk about goblinoids to start with. So goblins, everyone kind of has this idea of what goblins are, whether you be a Warhammer fan, a Lord of the Rings fan, or a Dungeons and Dragons pro. Goblins are kind of the universal, level 1 encounter for players in Dungeons and Dragons. And what I want to talk to you about is goblinoids. And goblinoids, going way back into 1979, and the first edition Monster Manual. You had goblins, bugbears, hobgoblins, orcs, and some would argue kobolds and ogres even. As the game progressed on into third edition and forward, there's still a tie between kobolds and orcs and ogres and the three core goblinoid races, which are goblins, bugbears, hobgoblins. Basically, from third edition forward is kind of how we're going to use the taxonomical reference. And that is that goblinoids are goblins, hobgoblins, and bugbears. So, what makes a goblinoid a goblinoid? Well, goblinoids are typically ranging from 3 to 7 feet tall. They are very lanky. They have earth tones for skins. They're not necessarily green. They can be green. But they're oftentimes a very yellowish brown to a reddish or even greenish in skin tone. And they're very earthy. Goblins are typically very muscular, even the smaller ones, but they can be lanky as well. So it creates a very sinewy, kind of hulking, hunchy kind of effect to them. And most goblinoids associate with each other. A lot of times you'll see goblins in the purchase of hobgoblins, which both of those may be in the purchase of bugbears. There's an overarching hierarchy, and that's what makes goblinoids so interesting. So let's move on to the bare bones then. Let's talk about goblins. Goblins are very small, and they'd be just basically nuisances and pests if there weren't so many of them. And that's what really makes goblins ferocious, is that there's so many of them. When you encounter them, you're encountering, either an entire tribe or a raiding party or something like that. Goblins typically, as you saw in the picture at the beginning, they have kind of flat faces, broad noses, very up-pointed ears. They always walk upright, but their arms hang down almost to their knees. Their skin ranges from yellowish to reddish, and even shades of orange. In later editions, goblins are sometimes associated with green skin, but that's typically reserved more for the orcs. Now, if you're thinking Tolkien goblins, a lot of times people think, the green-skinned Tolkien goblins. But in D&D, they're not so much green. They wear leatherish clothing. They carry, everything from shields to short swords to daggers. Some have slings, spears. They actually have been known to make their own leather clothing too, which is kind of neat. Their way that they speak is, you kind of heard earlier when I was mocking it. It's very high pitched and squealy. Think almost like a guttural, but nasally and high pitched. I guess that's the best way I can describe it to you. Goblins. Biggest thing about goblins, they hate sunlight. Absolutely hate it. They will avoid it at all costs if possible. The small little goblins attack at -1 in a lot of editions because the bright light hurts their eyes so much and they can't focus. So if they're going to attack you, they're going to attack at night. And at night, a lot of times throughout the editions, they've had night vision, infravision, the various different iterations of that. Their tactics are simple and crude. They'll pick a fight if they think they can win it. Otherwise, they're pretty cowardly. More often than not, they will attempt to arrange an ambush for their foes. and the keyword there is attempt. Most of the time, goblin attacks and surprises aren't very well coordinated. If they are, one can bet for sure, though, that there's probably a bigger power up there. Maybe a bigger, meaner type of goblin that's actually directing them. Where do goblins live? Goblins live, in underground caves. If they live in above ground, they're typically in abandoned ruins. They're not so much like in the forest and stuff as people might imagine. They can live anywhere that's not Arctic. They don't do well in the Arctic. They live a communal life. Everything is shared. They don't really have a sense of privacy. If you're an average Joe Blow goblin, you know exactly where you stand in your hierarchy. And they have a chief and sub-chief society. So the biggest, meanest goblin is going to be the boss. And it's always about, can you, one-up the guy ahead of you on the totem pole and climb to the top. That's what makes goblins goblins. They're very driven to be higher in their society, but they're not very smart. So that's something to keep in mind. Goblins do take slaves in basically raids and things like that. It's not uncommon to encounter slaves. They are very hostile towards humans and gnomes and dwarves in particular, and work to exterminate them whenever possible. Goblins are just hate-filled little creatures. They can live about 50 years. They don't eat much. They have a pretty slow metabolism, but they can eat a lot if they want to. They usually deplete an area of all resources. They'll hunt all the game, kill everything in sight. That's just how goblins work. They're decent miners. They can, they're not quite as proficient as dwarves, we'll say, but they can keep their own. If they're going to be in an underground tunnel, you can bet it's going to be like an anthill, like just tons of crazy offshoots and different little hidey holes. So how would you use a goblin in combat? So the way that you would want to use goblins in combat typically is ambush, at night. Try to get them to hit your parties at night. They will not fight during the day if they can avoid it. So keep that in mind. If you have a higher level party and you're using random encounter tables and you roll goblins, there's a couple ways to make them challenging for higher level players. And the way to do that is massive amounts. In the first edition Monster Manual, the number of goblins encountered in a random encounter was 40 to 400. So that gives you an idea of just like how many goblins there are, and that's what makes them dangerous. It's just the sheer volume. And you're going to make your wizards, have to use their fireballs and their lightning bolts and kind of their AoE stuff to take out all these goblins. Another cool thing you can do is wargs. Wargs are giant wolves, not quite the size of a dire wolf, not quite the size of like a timber wolf. They're a little bit bigger than that, smaller than a dire wolf. And goblins ride these in combat, and there's kind of a symbiotic relationship. And if you want to, you can use wargs to spice up your goblin encounters. Maybe you're encountering 40 goblins as higher a number of people, and higher level people too, and maybe 10 of them are on wargs that can pin players down and do things like that. Each edition kind of has its own variation of what a warg will do, but that's goblins in a nutshell.